One of the things that appealed to me about Williams was the fact that I came from Harvard, where I'd been teaching a lot of small group tutorials, and in those tutorials it really taught via discussion. And discussion to me is one of the greatest ways of teaching. To take a book, to take an article, to give it to students, and to try and make sense of it collectively in a class. And I tend to teach via discussion much more than by lecture, even in large classes with 40 students. So teaching the survey course that we offer in 20th century European history with 40 students, sometimes a few more, I'll often stress the importance of discussion, which makes me feel sometimes a little bit like Oprah Winfrey with the microphone going around saying, yes, and what do you think about the Nazis and how they came to power? But it usually works. And I want to share some thoughts about how I deal with discussion and what I've learned over the years of leading discussions in a class. I think there are lots of problems with asking questions to get discussions going. So for example, you can ask questions which are far too vague, far too general, and students will scratch their heads and not quite know where to go with them. What do you think about this book? You know, well, it's very, very vague. What do you want me to answer? What do you mean? What do I think about it? On the other hand, you can ask questions which are very precise, very technical, which have very short answers, yes-no answers, or small factual answers. And the problem with something like that is you're measuring someone's knowledge, someone's comprehension, but the main problem with that is that it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't open up a discussion for other people to get involved. And so I think the art of good discussion is to get a discussion going. The art of asking questions is to get students to engage with one another and to address those questions, but in so doing raising more questions that other people can address. And I think one does this in many ways by a process of telescoping, if you like. One starts off, I think, very, very general, moves into quite specifics, and then steps back at the end to more general questions. And I think the only way one can do this is by knowing exactly what you want to do with a piece of reading in a class. You have decided to put an article, to put a book on a reading list. Why is it there? How does it fit in with everything that is on the reading list or the other things that are on a reading list? What do you want to do with this particular book, this particular article? Why is it there? What do you want to achieve with it? What is it you want students to learn from this particular piece of writing? And it's there for a reason. You've put it there for a reason because it's important to you on some level. It does something. It does some work. What is it that it does? And how do you get students in the process of discussion to get to where you want them to be, to appreciate those things in that particular reading that are important to you? And I think that part of the art of a good discussion is being able to answer these questions beforehand, knowing what it is you want students to come away with after you've discussed the reading. And I think the most important thing is that a good class is a class that ends up with students coming away learning more, knowing more, thinking more about something they've read, and understanding more about it than they would have done had they read the book on their own without the benefit of class discussion. So how does one do this? In concrete terms, what are the skills that one, I think, needs to develop in order to bring this about, to have a successful class where students leave at the end really excited because they've seen things in a book that they didn't see the night before when they read it alone in the library? And I want to talk a little bit about this by giving an example. In a class I teach on the philosophy of history, one of the books we read is a book by Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which I'll wave around and hope the camera sees. And it's a wonderful book. It's Karl Marx's attempt to write a materialist history of the revolutions of 1848 in France. And we use it as an example of a type of historical writing in the 19th century. And what I want students to do is to understand the structure of the argument. What is it that Karl Marx is doing in this book? And why is it so unique? Why is it that nobody has done this before? And so earlier I talked a little bit about how discussion needs to be telescopic in a way. You start out generally, you telescope in to something quite specific, and then you broaden out again. So I want to talk a little bit about this. I may start out in a class, for example, with those general questions. What are your general thoughts about this book? Did you enjoy reading it? Did it strike you as being a little odd, a little different from what we've read before? Now, these questions will often not really go anywhere, and I don't think one should dwell on them for too much time, but they kind of give you a sense of where people are. They give you a sense of, you know what you're working with. You listen to students who say, oh, I really, really dislike this, and you don't need to know why at this particular time, or I was really excited about it, or I was bored, or you have a feel for where students are and what you may need to do and what you may need to stress in discussion. After that, because this is a book that deals with a very complicated set of events, I want to get those events down on the table so that we all know, we all have that factual background, we all know what we're talking about. So what I'll tend to do with this particular book is then reconstruct the narrative, just basically get the chain of events that Marx is talking about in this book. What happened in January 1848, February, March, April? What is the general structure of the events that took place in these revolutionary days in France between 1848 and 1851? And I'll simply go around the table. Okay, next person. What happened next? What happened next? What happened next? And we can go around the table, somebody will pass if they're not quite familiar. So just that we have a good sense of the events. And now what we've done is two things. We have a general impression of the book, and we've reconstructed the events that Marx is talking about. But that's just the basics. That's just sort of starting out in a way. And the next thing, and the most important thing, is to analyze Marx's argument. How is this an example of historical materialism? What are the links between class, social being, and political action, political beliefs that Marx is trying to develop here? How does Marx develop an argument about the relationship between one's class and one's politics? And this, I think, is something where one then needs to telescope in on precise details. What is the relationship between individuals and their politics? Individuals as bearers of particular class interests. And what I like to do at this particular point in this book is to talk specifically about different groups of people and their politics. Who are the landed bourgeoisie? Who are the financial bourgeoisie? Why does Marx make a distinction between them? Why is he making a distinction between their politics based on their material interests? And I think we can go through this with each particular group. And there are moments when we do this, I think that we need to stop and really talk about particular passages in the book. So for example, there are two groups of individuals who Marx, I think, has some difficulty fitting into his story. Intellectuals. Are intellectuals representative of a class? Do they have class interests? What about the peasants? Marx spends a lot of time talking about the peasants. He talks about them being a class but not having consciousness of themselves as being part of a class. So what I like to do here is to stop and actually pick out precise passages and stop and have us read those passages aloud. Indeed, either I'll read them aloud or I'll ask a student to read them aloud. And that means really knowing ahead of time what it is you want to focus on and why you want to focus on it. And I'll have students look at these passages and we'll discuss them. So where do these individuals fit in? Where does this group fit in to Marx's general story? What is he trying to argue here? Do you find the argument actually works, or are there problems with this? And so what we've done is we've come in from the broad general contours of the book, the nuts and bolts, the basic chronological narrative of events, to analyze the argument, moving more and more and more precise in our analysis, that we're actually unpicking particular paragraphs in the text. And then at that point, I think one can then begin to move back out, and this is the next step, where I think one really needs to stand back and to assess where we've just been, to assess the argument and its strengths and weaknesses. But we can only do this once we're actually familiar with that argument, once we actually know what it is that Marx is arguing. So then one can begin to ask the more general questions about the argument. Is this a book in which Marx really tries to reduce everything to class struggle, to material interest? Is there any realm of autonomy for ideas? And also related to this, does it work? Are you convinced? Is this an argument that seems watertight to you, or are there problems with it? And if there are problems, where are they? And why do you see problems? And if other people don't see problems, why don't you see problems when your friend over here does see problems? And I think those are the kinds of questions that one can end up with, which is standing back and taking stock of the argument in general. But I think it's only possible to do that after students are really, really familiar with the argument, which requires that kind of precise analysis of the argument as it's developed and of particular passages in the argument. And then finally, telescoping right back out again. I think there's that moment where you can put this book into the context of the class as a whole. I like classes that I devise to tell a story. And I like a syllabus not simply to consist of isolated works that have no relationship to each other, but to be in dialogue with one another as part of a larger story. So that, of course, itself is a particular kind of narrative, tells a particular kind of story. And so this is a book that is set in the midst of a series of other books and other articles. And students obviously don't know necessarily what's going to happen next, but they know what's happened before. And so one can then say, this kind of argument that Marx is making, how does it differ from the kinds of arguments you've encountered beforehand by other individuals who you've read in the class? How is this radically new? How does it differ from where you've been before? And I think at that point you can then use this work to set up where you're going next. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that teaching discussion requires several things. First of all, it requires one to be absolutely aware of why a book is on the syllabus and what you want to do with it, and what it is you want students to learn from that particular reading. And then it requires you both going over the basics, making sure students are familiar with the structure and logic of the argument, by asking very precise questions before moving back out to a kind of general reflection. And if all goes well, one question naturally leads to another. Students are excited about the flow of the discussion and engage with each other's points. And it's always a little bit of a tug of war at times, because I think that you as an instructor should have a clear sense of what you want students to learn from this reading, and the ways in which you set up your questions should indeed lead students to where you want them to be, not in terms of an ideological conclusion, but in terms of a conclusion of learning, of what you want students to learn. But at the same time, students need to have the freedom to take the small points that they want to make off in various directions where they may go, and engage with other students. But you need then to bring them back to make sure that you end up where you want everybody to be, in terms of what you want students to learn from that. And that requires, I think, a lot of preparation, and a great familiarity with the work you want to engage students with. And if all goes well, then at the end of class, students will walk away being very excited about having learned more from a book, more from an article, than they might have done had they just read it on their own, from the benefit of your interrogations, your questioning, and their engagement with each other in the context of a good class discussion. From an article.